Good afternoon. I'm Bilal Orfali. I'm a senior fellow at the Library of Arabic Literature here at NYU Abu Dhabi, where we are today. And I am the Sheikh Zayed Chair of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the American University of Beirut. And today I'm having a conversation with my friend Julia Bray, Professor Julia Bray. So this conversation is about her latest publication, a new Library of Arabic Literature volume under the title of Stories of Piety and Prayer. Julia Bray is the Abdulaziz Saoud Al-Babtin Laudium Professor of Arabic at Oxford University. She is the author of numerous publications in the field. I'm not going to name them or name her foundational articles, but I'm going to say something about her research interests that include, but are not restricted to, the techniques of medieval Arabic writing and its social and political functions, how poetry and narrative create and explore ideas, life writing and storytelling, Arabic book culture, the Arabic history of emotions. Julia Bray recently and rather ambitiously is translating al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah, Deliverance Follows Adversity of the Abbasid judge and literature al-Tanūkhī. The first volume of the book was published earlier this year under the title of Stories of Piety and Prayer. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you very much.
Julia, what's the importance of Tanūkhī and al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah in particular in the history of Arabic literature?
Tanūkhī is a rather unusual figure in Arabic literature in that he wrote books, two books, which I think need to be discussed in relation to each other. Deliverance Follows Adversity, al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah, and what was translated into English as The Table Talk of a Mesopotamian Judge, Nishwa al-Muhadara. These books immediately became popular, and they stayed popular. And it's rather unusual for any author to have such a long, uninterrupted run of popularity as Tanūkhī did, with two books, not with just one. It is the content of the books, I suppose, that primarily has made him important when he underwent a revival in modern scholarship. His books had been quoted throughout the Middle Ages, but it wasn't until the 1920s that Nishwa al-Muhadara was rediscovered, The Table Talk of a Mesopotamian Judge, in bits and pieces. The lost bits have never been found. First of all, by a British scholar called D.S. Margoliouth. There had been publications in Arabic of bits of it before, but he decided to translate it and edit it as he went along. And the theory, which I think is a good one, which is the problems of translation will tell you what the textual problems are and help you to solve them. So Tanūkhī immediately became popular again among modern scholars because he was regarded as a source of history of all kinds, keyhole political history, agrarian history, judicial history, intellectual history, an absolutely unparalleled source, and he is quoted all the time in modern scholarship thanks to that. Al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah, Deliverance Follows Adversity, which had been just as important, had not been so fortunate in a sense in the 20th century. It was published in very poor editions until the 1970s, when Abu Dashalji came along, and having republished The Table Talk of a Mesopotamian Judge, he then turned to al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah and published an edition which was based on many more manuscripts, which shows the evolution of the text, if you can call it evolution. The fact that this is a text that went through many authorial handlings, I think, is clear. Even from Shalji's edition, he was restricted by his circumstances to the manuscripts that he could access, but still he did a wonderful job. And his edition is also enriched by his footnotes, which are not only historical, but because he was a judge, he was an Iraqi, he lived through a change of pace of life in the same way as Tanūkhī did, from a traditional way of life to a more modern way of life, from one regime to another. He had enormous personal empathy with Tanūkhī, and this is reflected in his very valuable footnotes. And in this empathy, this is one of the things that makes Tanukhi so enormously valuable. I think everybody responds to Tanukhi in the same way. Immediately with empathy, they feel this is their author and that they understand something about him that nobody else does. And that is one of the really remarkable things about him.
This is fascinating, especially coming from someone who's interested in the history of emotions. I find this absolutely fascinating. Actually, speaking about emotions, right? You once told me, I remember, that the book meant a lot to Tanukhi, right? As a memorial for his contacts, right? His father, he actually comes from a family of judges, right?
He comes from two families of judges.
Absolutely.
And this is something which had been noticed by Margoliouth, but he couldn't prove it. Shalji, the same, he couldn't prove it. Tanukhi came from a family that his father was very distinguished. He was a boon companion, a court companion of the famous Vizier Muhallabi, who was also a great patron of adab and notably of al-Faraj al-Isfahani, the author of the Book of Songs. And so through his father he had contact with all the great littérateurs
this,
of
of course,
his age.
reflected in the book itself, the stories.
And this is very obvious in many ways in the Table Talk of a Mesopotamian Judge, because he keeps talking about his father, as he does in Deliverance Follows Adversity. But if you don't know that his father married into another very famous judicial family, a family of judges and muhaddiths, so very pious, very backbones of society, as it were. And if you know this, then you can identify all sorts of other people that he doesn't say are his relatives, but they are.
So the book meant a lot to him, right? To his teachers, his family, his companions, his contacts, etc. You just also mentioned that it meant a lot to the editor, Shalji, right?
It meant a lot to him.
What did it mean to you to actually translate this book?
Well,
on the personal level?
I met Shalji when he was, well, he was about to die. He was in London. He was undergoing treatment. I don't know who it was that made it possible for me to get to know him, very briefly. But I told him, you know, how much I admired his edition and how much I had always hoped to translate al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah. And he blessed me and he said, "You are my daughter, and go ahead and do it." So of course this put it in a very special light for me. But there is another sort of isnad, a silsila, which goes back a long way. I am the 15th occupant of my chair in Oxford. And the person who taught me, who was very dear to me, was the 12th occupant of this chair. He was called Freddie Beeston, and he was extremely fond of Tanukhi. He didn't embark on large-scale translations of Tanukhi, but he translated little bits here and there. He had been taught by the person who occupied his chair 2 professors back, who was in fact Margoliouth, who was the rediscoverer of Tanukhi, who, for a Western audience, made him into one of the main sources that every Western scholar cites when they're writing about the 10th century. And he, in turn, was 12th in succession to the very first Laudian professor of Arabic, who, before he was given this chair in 1636, was an agent of Archbishop Laud, who sent him to the Middle East to buy Arabic books. And one of the books that he bought was a very important fragmentary manuscript of al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah, which is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is enriched by having very, very full isnads. So it's one of the 3 manuscripts that I know that bears this really enhanced evidence of the personal nature of the book.
So can I safely say that translating this book is a tribute to all these people who taught you your own silsila?
Yes, and it makes it, of course, very much harder because you feel that this is a sort of, well, it is a sacred trust. And it's more difficult to do than if you just sat down in cold blood doing something that doesn't mean anything to you.
So the book actually means a lot to me too, right? It's part of my education. And when I was charged to do this Library of Arabic Literature for the youth, it's a new project of the Library of Arabic Literature. The first book I thought of is actually al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah and al al-Muhadara, al-Tanūkhī as an author. Have you looked at our small volume?
I've looked at your volume and at the brilliant illustrations, and I've also now heard you speak about the various outreach schemes that you have, and about orality and performance, which I think totally transform the way that these things work, the way that one looks at them, the way that they can work in an outreach program.
Have you thought about doing your own anthology, actually, of the work, or of the two works?
Well, I have thought of exactly the opposite, because it seems to me that Tanukhi's Deliverance, at any rate, is an anthology,
right,
in a way that Nishwar, the table talk, is not, because the table talk is gathered from his own reminiscences and not from his reading and the teaching that he received, whereas Deliverance is a combination of what he got through personal contact by listening and taking part in conversations, and what came to him through study and through formal instruction and contact with his teachers. So they are very different, and it is the difference between them and the way that he worked as an author in each, which in fact captures the essence of his personality and his thinking. And we have two different examples of his thinking in the two anthologies. Of the two, it might look as if Deliverance is fairly conventional, it's very well structured, though in fact this structure is revolutionary, and I'd like a chance to talk about that in a minute. But the fact that it's so well organized makes it look as if he's in control of his material. But what is fascinating about it is, if you read his introduction, he clearly, he never felt quite comfortable about it. He kept on altering things. And the material, which spans a gamut of human experience of every kind, high, low, ribald, serious, heroic, not really very creditable at all, you might look at it in a sort of positive way as reconciling all these things, showing, you know, the richness of God's world and so on. And in a way, that's what it does. But all the tensions are also there in the way that these things are juxtaposed under a title umbrella in a given chapter, or the big title in the whole book. And it's a book about trying to make sense of things which don't really make sense.
So my question is, you just hinted to this, right? He was in al-Faraj, baʿd, al-shiddah, right? Deliverance Follows Adversity. Is a genre, of course, in Arabic literature. Al-Tanūkhī was not the first to write such a book.
He admits that he wasn't the first, but
he actually accredits these people, Ibn Abi Dunya in particular, right? How is the book different in terms of content and in terms of structure? You just mentioned structure. How is the book different from other works of the genre?
Well, Tanūkhī himself, in his introduction, is quite plain about this, and also quite accurate, although he does his best to throw his predecessors into the shade. He points out that their books are not very large, and they manage, in some cases, to combine being neither comprehensive nor consistent, so they have stuff in them that oughtn't to be there, and leave out stuff that ought to be there, and they're not well organized like his. And he cites all his authorities. He's at pains to say he attributes everything to its source. And generally, one of the things that he puts his finger on is that it is a revolution in terms of organization. What he doesn't say, which is even more important, is that this is the first work, as far as I know, of analytical narratology in Arabic prose, and it's hugely important. The way that he combines in sequence different versions of a given story. Different versions, I call them stories because they're narratives, but they're, you know, some of them are hadith, some of them are retellings of the Quran, some of them are this, that, and the other. And it is both technically extremely interesting to see the sensitivity with which he can articulate the different sections, the different working sections of a story, and analyze where they branch off in different directions when there are variants, but also the whole idea of what a story is, if it can have all these different variants, sometimes completely different endings, and yet be the same story, and presumably point in something of the same direction. So this is really very complex.
Yeah. So my next question is about the reception of the book, right? It seems to me that the book really has something to offer to everyone.
Yes.
Right? You have written about the isnads and the family connections, about medicine, for example. You and others have talked about his Mu'tazili, relations or thoughts. I think there was an article by Florian Sobiroj about his anti-Sufi tendencies, right? About dreams in al-Tanūkhī, for example. A lot of people, scholars from different disciplines have approached al-Tanūkhī as a source of information, right? Have you taught this book, and what did your students think about it when you teach it, right? And who do you think will read the English translation? Who is the audience and of this new English translation? Who should read it?
One of the audiences probably is going to be everybody who is interested in the 1001 Nights, because one of the remarkable things about Deliverance Follows Adversity is that it combines different levels, if you like, of literature. There's popular literature in there as well as high literature, and its reception immediately made it popular. And we have manuscripts which are really pretty illiterate manuscripts which show that side of its reception. So I think the first lot of people who will be interested in it inevitably are 1001 Nights people. I think we will still have the same audience of historians who want to get data out of it, but I hope very much that we will have people who are interested in how people thought and the various ways in which people could think differently and indeed think different things by using adab, by using poetry, as opposed to through legal reasoning, for example, which of course Tanukhi could have done had he wished. And I hope also, particularly, that this will be used in teaching religion courses, because this is a really important example, and one of the very rare ones, of lived religion which, as it were, doesn't come from within a technical tradition. So it's not Sufi literature, for example. He is somebody whose beliefs would certainly bear a lot of digging into. He thought that he was a rationalist, Mu'tazili, and so on. But he was obviously a bit more complicated than that,
right.
Or he would never have embarked on this enterprise in the first place. So human experience and what people feel through that experience and what it makes them think and believe, I think, are very important and should be part of the way that people teach religion, which they probably do in world religion courses, but I think it's perhaps not yet the case in
Islam.
No. Well, certainly not in the Western Academy.
Absolutely. What were some of the challenges in translating this book?
Some of the challenges were peculiar to Tanukhi and to this volume in particular. In his introduction to the whole book, which prefaces this volume, he uses a certain number of key words which are then going to be repeated in the first 3 chapters. Some of them are Quranic, some of them are from Hadith. They all have particular resonances. And I discovered that if you did the usual thing, which you find both in translations of the Quran and in translations of ordinary Arabic, which is to vary the translation according to context to tease out the particular appropriate aspect of the meaning, then if you did that, it would be very difficult for a reader who didn't have the Arabic in front of them to feel that there were these recurrences and each time gaining in resonance and richness and so on. So that was difficult. One of the things that is difficult is common to all Arabic, and particularly to Arabic of this period, which is very, very economical, and it's the management of dialogue and of narrative and of how you get people moving about and speaking to each other. So there's only one verb which is used, which fronts whatever people say, so it's qala. And you can't have all the variations and repositionings that you get in English, nor do you have punctuation, though of course you can put that into the English. It's very rare for people to use indirect style in writing, so the dialogue is always upfront direct style, and you want to keep that so that in the cases where there is actually indirect style, that can be seen. And of course, getting people in and out of rooms is something which is done differently in different languages, and it's done very economically in this Arabic. It turns out to be very difficult to do in English, especially if you don't know exactly what the objects are and where they are and how people got from A to B. I think that a lot of people will not approve of my choices as a translator because of my feeling that medieval translation poses particular responsibilities. I found from experience that if you replace an Arabic idiom or metaphor by a normal English one that automatically produces itself in your mind, if the image is different, then even sophisticated readers will say, "Isn't that extraordinary? In the medieval period in Arabic, they had exactly the same expression as we do." And I really do want to avoid misleading people in that way. And when there is a coincidence of thought and expression, I want it to be a real coincidence. So that's not something that all translators would approve of. They might prefer, as it were, a totally independent text. But I've come across this problem so often that I really do want to avoid it. Making texts reliable for people who do comparative literature and so on.
Excellent. Deliverance Follows Adversity, al-Faraj baʿd al-shiddah, Stories of Piety is a new addition to the Library of Arabic Literature. Thank you, Julia Bray, for the book and for this interview.
Thank you very much, Bilal.